I started thinking, well, how did this Jordan River border end up as a contested border by Israelis and Palestinians? And here the answer is neither the Bible nor the fact that it is, as many would say, a natural border. The Ottoman Empire spanned what we call today the Middle East, and the British ousted them in World War I. Following this period, it literally became a discussion among Europeans what kind of political system to create in those territories. So these nation states that we talk about today, whether it's Iraq or Syria or Jordan or Israel or Lebanon, are ultimately products of these European discussions. The most important driving force was the burgeoning oil economy. And so it was most important that to the British and the French as well to create terrain and political systems that would facilitate the massive export of oil to Europe. During this period of time, Jewish as well as Arab nationalists disseminated all kinds of geographic ideas, all kinds of political systems, federations, binational states, regional models, more land, less land. There were a lot of ideas that were on the table in the Jewish and the Arab national camps. Ultimately, when the British drew the lines, including the eastern border at the Jordan, suddenly Arab as well as Jewish nationalists became very certain about where their desired homeland lay. So ultimately, it's neither the Bible nor Islamic traditions nor long ethnic ideas that led to these borders. They were British lines on a map to facilitate oil export and administrative units of the British Mandate. And so these borders become the ones that are so contested and so sensitive within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Zionists did not draw a map and did not define biblical Israel until 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference. At this point, the Zionists drew a map that in the east went almost to the Hijaz Railway. So they aspired to that to the east, Beersheba in the south, the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and the Litani River in the north. And they drew this map on the basis of biblical traditions. And they submitted this to the British. But then 1921 comes, the British start fixing the Jordan as a border, and the mainstream Zionist movement drops the East Bank tradition. So in other words, the British drew the lines, and what happened subsequently in both cases, in the Arab national as well as in the Jewish national camp, all kinds of religious and cultural traditions are mustered to justify the claims to exactly the borders drawn by the British. So in fact, this imperial construction ultimately determines the national aspirations of Jews or Israelis and Palestinians. Israel exists in an unstable state, right, without declared borders. So there's this whole question of where and what is this place? And part of me thinks that there's a lot of possibility there. The fact that the state of Israel is not fixed, is fluid, means that there is the possibility of a different kind of formation or the simultaneous existence of many interpretations. What I'm proposing is ultimately a regional approach that would begin with no longer projecting these national desires, national myths, if you will, onto the existing landscape, but instead stopping and actually looking at who lives there and where they are and what their resource needs are. And so instead of aspiring somehow to a fixed separate Israel or a fixed separate Palestine, let's admit it's a fluid place with all kinds of population mixtures, and that in fact, however violent and however brutal, people are living side by side in the same place. So what I really advocate is a regional idea, particularly an idea of federated regions. So there'd be a federal system to deal with taxation, tariff, import issues, but at the same time you would also have regional representative bodies that would deal with the concerns of the populace. And when I talk about this, I'm also talking about full enfranchisement of Palestinians and a system of a just distribution of resources. So a lot of what's behind my stressing that these borders are artificial is that also the national mythologies that suspend these borders and continue to charge them with desire and emotion and passion. Let's scale it back and let's look at what the borders are. They're the construct of British Empire to help get oil to Europe. You know, there aren't very many people who are ready to say the two-state solution is over. I mean, just to historicize that, and we can't forget that as much as the borders of Mandate Palestine are a British construct, so is the idea of partition, right? The British during World War I made grand promises to Jewish as well as Arab nationalists. And so the British brought in commissions and they started trying to parcel the land of drawing more artificial lines so that they could maintain these promises for a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And partition didn't work in 1938. It didn't work in 1947. It brings us to the occupation that results from the 1967 war. And we spent, the 1990s and 2000s as Americans investing tremendous money and resource in this idea that never came to fruition, that did not relieve the burden of the occupation on Palestinians, that did nothing to assuage Israeli fear of being under attack, and didn't come into being. So I think that, once and for all, let's abandon this idea and let's start thinking of something else. I mean, we just can't keep recycling this notion, which was a bad idea to begin with. It's not going to come into being, and there are huge questions about who it would even serve if it did come into being. Ancient Israel was very fluid. Right? We tend to think that, people in antiquity knew who they were and where they belonged, but it was a very fluid model. And in fact, it really seems that the beginnings of ancient Israel was a tribal confederation. And a tribal confederation had groups constantly coming in and moving out. So it was a constantly morphing idea. It's not as if there was this ancient Israel that remained stable throughout time. Going back to the idea of the Bible, there are two maps that have really impacted political life. And one of these is that this idea from the book of Deuteronomy and related sources of sort of, the expansionist idea of conquest and expelling indigenous others. The other idea, the kind of priestly idea of a discrete land that ends at the Jordan River. These have participated in a prominent way in modern political thought. But there are other maps there. And the ones that I talk about in the book that I try to make available also for political use are, on the one hand, this idea of the northern kingdom of Israel, where boundaries aren't fixed lines. They're open, fluid frontiers. And people cross them, they go in and out, but there also is a very potent geographic tradition in the book of Joshua. In chapters 12 through 21, there are all of these regional maps, or boundary lists, if you will, and they talk about the tribes of Israel ultimately settling and living, and they concede to the fact that Israel under Joshua did not expel everyone or exterminate them, but rather that they lived alongside them. And so we see in these traditions in the book of Joshua the coexistence of overlapping claims, the simultaneity of different identities and different peoples, and we also really get to a regional model. In chapter 15 of the book of Joshua, there's even a verse that says, until today, the tribe of Judah and the Jebusites live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is divided between them. So there, right in the Bible, is the idea of a shared Jerusalem, which really is much closer to the reality of contemporary Jerusalem, and it has biblical precedent. So I would say to those who say, wait, Jerusalem must be Judaicized, Palestinians must be run out of their neighborhoods, and the idea is this has to be done in the name of King David, I would tell them to look closer at the text and see how these traditions of coexistence have as much root in the Bible as the military traditions that inspired the early movement and the wars in many ways.
Take these words home and think.